Making the right policy choices will define the future of the world economy.
The managing director of the International Monetary Fund warns of a possible decade of weak global growth. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Policymakers will gather in Washington next week for the annual IMF World Bank spring meetings. The managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, says the meetings come at a sensitive time for the world economy. We begin with this report from CGTN's Jim Spellman.
In a preview speech, the IMF managing director says next week's spring meetings come at a crucial time for the global economy, that policy decisions made now will determine how history judges this decade.
Will it go down in history as the turbulent 20s, a time of disruptions and divergence in economic fortunes, or the tepid 20s, a time of slow growth and popular discontent, or the transformational 20s, a time of rapid technological advancements for the good of humanity?
The release of the World Economic Outlook is a key part of each year's spring meetings. The managing director said this year's outlook will show marginally stronger global growth. That's mostly credited to an increase in consumption and business investments, plus the easing of supply chain disruptions. And strong labor markets, driven in part by immigration, have helped maintain economic resilience. She anticipates cooling inflation will likely set the stage for central bank rate cuts in the second half of the year, but warns against cutting rates too fast. She notes that global economic activity is low compared to other eras and warns that many challenges remain.
Prospects for growth have been slowing since the global financial crisis. Just look at this graph. And inflation is not fully defeated. Fiscal buffers, on the other hand, have been depleted, and debt is up, posing a major challenge to public finances in many countries.
The managing director also warned of the hazards of protectionism, warning that geopolitical tensions risk the fragmentation of important economies, and that fragmentation could create a drag on the entire global economy. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
For more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from New York is Qiang. He's the Assistant Director of the International Monetary Institute at China's Renmin University. Also with us from New York, Anthony Chan is the former Chief Economist for JP Morgan Chase and Company. From London, Klisman Murati is the Managing Director of Pareto Economics and creator of the Global Power Index. And here in our Washington, D.C. studio, Otaviano Canuto is a Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and a former Vice President and Executive Director at the World Bank. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Otaviano, let's start right here in the studio, and let's start with that address by the IMF Managing Director there. In that address, she talked about either this being the turbulent 20s or the tepid 20s, but she's estimating an annual growth rate, global growth rate, that is, of just over 3%. Some analysts have said that's a little bit too conservative. How do you see it?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here again, Anand. Well, the issues that she raised to explain the prognosis, they're sounded. Look. Geoeconomic fragmentation. It's going to be costly in terms of economic growth. For more that national policies or other objectives might be announced, the fact of the matter is that concretely the trade protectionism will be costly. Second, the fiscal policies that have helped sustain the ongoing recovery, and they will have to be reversed at a certain moment in the future. There will have to be some sort of a fiscal adjustment, as one may note from the projections by the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, right. As well as in Europe. And also, the interest rates definitely have moved to an upper level as compared to levels that prevailed over the previous decade. The only point that may make a difference, and it's the major factor between the two scenarios that she refers to, is on the side of productivity. There is a strong hope that AI and the structural reform that she mentions, I was there at the Atlantic Council watching her talk, that might countervail the tendency of low performance in terms of productivity. Because in fact, the productivity has not performed as well as many expected in the last few years. And ultimately, economic growth depends on productivity.
Right, when you talk about geoeconomic fragmentation, those are political challenges, aren't they? Yes. And might they actually be, could economic and fiscal policies dictate what the politics does?
Contrary-wise, the politics might dictate what the fiscal policies are. Ultimately, once in Brookings, where I'm also a non-resident senior fellow, Jake Sullivan, the White House National Security Advisor, came and spoke about how we economists tend to look at the free trade gains and so on, but there are also other objectives that need to be pursued, which may be in detriment to economics. Okay, so it's not up to me or to economists to say anything about this, but the appeal that the multilateral institutions make is to keep inside that these things are costly. They cost in terms of foregone GDP and so on.
Xu Qiang, let's talk about China. China will release its numbers for the first quarter next week. Goldman Sachs, the investment bank, revised its projection for year-on-year economic growth for the first quarter and for the year to 5%. That's well above the global average. What are your expectations?
I think 5% is a fair number. First of all, 5% is not a binding target, which means the government actually, give it a roundabout number is about 5%. Well, according to our experience of last year, it's also been set the target at 5%, but eventually turns out to be 5.2%. Actually, by numbers, I'm very confident about this target to be achieved again by the end of this year. For example, if I take a look at the facilities being utilized by the Central Bank of China, we have some of the wrap-up investment, from the end of last year, which makes about like 2 trillion Chinese yuan. And also at the beginning of the year, actually after 2 sessions, we confirmed about another like 5 or 6 trillion Chinese yuan. And also come after that, we're going to have lots of other facilities, for example, like the loans from the central bank or some other similar package or the fiscal packages. So put together, roughly we did a calculation, is about 10 trillion Chinese yuan. This is a very, very large, impetus into the whole economy. So I think that will generate a certain kind of the effect. And for sure, Chinese balance sheet, no matter from the local government, from the property developers, from the household, or to the general private sectors, are getting recovered. So we think this year is going to be a very steady, slow, but a recovering year. So 5% of the target, or 5.2%, will be again achieved, I think.
Anthony Chen, the IMF managing director, she had a very positive outlook for the US economy. I mean, we've got unemployment, which is very, very low. There is growth, but inflation remains a concern. We just saw those recent numbers that came up, and inflation has been ticking upwards. That, of course, has led to the fact that there's very little hope there's going to be interest rate cuts very soon. So how do you see all of this playing out?
Well, when I look at the inflation numbers, I take the position that we are making progress, maybe not as rapid as people would like. But we should not lose sight of the fact that the headline consumer price index peaked at 9.1%, and now that headline number is 3.5%. So I challenge anybody to say that going from 9.1% to 3.5% is not progress. And I also feel that the inflation story is bad, but consumers are making progress. The latest average hourly earnings number is up 4.1%. And the inflation number on the CPI is up 3.5%. So that tells me that consumers may be continuing to spend because they are actually ahead, making more than the inflation rate. Now, of course, when you say that, somebody's going to jump and say, but you seem to forget that we had a huge inflation problem since 2020. And that is true, because since 2020, February, what you saw was that the consumer price index has been up 20.4%. That's a lot for consumers to absorb. But over that same period, guess what? Average hourly earnings are up 21.5%. 21.5%. So even if you go back to the month before the pandemic began, the consumers have increased their wages faster than the consumer price index.
Right, Anthony, of course, the hope is that inflation will be heading downwards, but there was also a warning from JP Morgan, which said that a big increase in government spending, especially on military expenditure, healthcare, as well as shifting global supply chains, could lead to what JP Morgan says is, and I'm quoting them here, a stickier inflation and higher rates than the market expects. What do you make of that?
I don't disagree with that. I think that what you're finding is it's getting more challenging to get down to 2%. What I have a problem with is with people saying that we have not made any progress. And so somehow the definition of progress is only when you get to 2%, but they seem to forget that when you go from 9 to 3.5%, that's not progress. Now, from here on, it's going to be more challenging because we may see that inflation slows, but it takes its time. And that's one of the reasons why Chairman Powell says we will eventually get to 2%. He has never said we're going to get to 2% in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, or even within the next 6 months. But we will get there. Unfortunately, it's taking longer, and maybe it may even take a year, year and a half, even 2 years. But we are moving in that direction. And the question is, should we pay such a high price as to cause a severe recession in order to get to 2% much quicker? Or should we be patient if we're heading in that direction, even if it takes a year and a half, and just wait and avoid some serious negative implications for the U.S. economy?
Klisman, Murati, the inflation concerns are concentrating the minds of those in charge. I mean, there was another warning on that point by the IMF managing director. Let's listen to what she had to say.
Premature easing can see new inflation surprises that may even necessitate a further bout of monetary tightening. And we have to recognize, on the other side, delaying too long could pour cold water on economic activity.
So, Klisman, how much of a challenge is that for central banks when it comes to interest rates?
Well, it's definitely a challenge, which is why I think the Bank of England has kept its position since August and not changing the interest rate since August. So it's been constantly at 5.25% since then, and they're very cautious in moving it up or down. There's a lot of internal talk and dynamic debate within the committee of the Bank of England as to what they should do. I think what they're also looking at are externalities that they can't control, geopolitical risk and others, which have a lag in terms of its impact on the economy. So I think there are some externalities that they're waiting to see how they play out. And as the comments there mentioned, they're between a rock and a hard place. They don't want to do it too early. They don't want to do it too fast. And I think that what they're also doing is waiting from signals by the Fed maybe to see what they do, which then will at least give them some sort of permission or credence to change their rates in alignment with the Fed. But given how interconnected, especially Western economies are, I think they need to take an approach which is bold and confident based on the numbers and based on what their thesis is for growth over the next 12 months, which is hard to develop given how volatile the international markets are and how much they can't control the externalities which impact the economy.
Otaviano, the other point that the IMF managing director made was about rising concerns over protectionism, driven in part by something that you talked about already, which is geopolitical tensions. So what are the risks for global growth if the barriers start going up again?
Well, the risks are of a downfall, even deeper of economic growth, particularly as we are already watching, for instance, a global war of subsidies.
Yes.
We are already watching the signals of the will by many policymakers to disregard the gains from trade and so on, and to establishing barriers and so on. And these impacts are cumulatively pointing down to a lower economic growth, because it's going to make more difficult to have low inflation, because of course if you replace imports with less efficient domestic production of things, this goes to rising costs and makes the presence of sudden shocks, price shocks, more often. So while we lived in an area after the global financial crisis in which we had insufficiency of aggregate demand, when the tendency was exactly deflationary and so on, with central banks pumping up a resource through the quantitative easing. Now we have had in the last few years this combination of shocks coming from the supply side, including, of course, I'm talking about the pandemic, the problems with logistics, I'm talking about the wars, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I'm talking about now the fears about the conflict between Hamas and Israel spilling over into something broader with respect to oil and so on. But the fact of the matter that we also have seen supply shocks coming from these policies. The bottom line is that the appearance of sudden inflationary shocks is more likely in this new world that we are living through. One important thing as well, if I may, Anna, it was very well put by not only Kristalina mentioned it, but also Anthony, the good performance of the U.S. economy, which has surprised many analysts. After all, we had such a hike of interest rates, and nonetheless, the GDP growth maintained, and the levels of employment remained very high. And well, there are supply side and demand side behind those that performance. On the demand side, the fiscal policies, the very aggressive, expensive fiscal policies, including the IRA, including the bill on semiconductors and so on, as well as the use of excess savings by the households who received so much money during the pandemic and so on. This is winding down now, but anyway, it helped explain the performance. But also on the supply side. And on supply side, to the surprise of many, the increase in the rate of labor force participation associated with the immigration. The employment levels of U.S.-born, for instance, citizens, kind of was reasonably stable, but what grew dramatically and translated itself into GDP was the entry of immigrants, foreign-born citizens.
Interesting you say that, because that's not what we hear on the campaign trail.
Yes, of course.
Xu Qiang, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, she was in Beijing, met with Premier Qiang. I mean, both saw the relationship, the trade relationship, the economic relationship as being stable. But if we look at the situation, the tariffs are still in place, and we have the United States still moving to cut China off from advanced technology. So what is the outlook?
Well, the outlook is that we're going to have a rather tight situation, but not breaking up with each other, that's for sure. I think Janet actually, if she does mean it to China and America, will not decouple with each other, that's for sure. But about de-risking, I'm not sure about that situation. Like you just mentioned, there's still lots of the frictions and the sanctions we're putting on China. And I think, U.S. are still trying to gaslighting about the Chinese policies, telling what we should do, and even though they're not going to decouple with China. So I think in the future, we are going to still shake hands with each other, still cooperate with each other, in many fronts, because in the whole world, let's face it, we still have lots of common challenges. This year, well, we're going to face probably a very unprecedented, climate disasters hitting all over the globe, and that's going to push up, the inflations and the job situation, and also the economic recession, all over the world. So, which requires China and America to shake hands with each other, China and EU and America to work with each other. This is a done deal, but still we have not seen major breakthrough of technologies. We still do not see the major easing of the geopolitical conflicts. So people will still, instead of making a bigger cake, but will focus more on how to, cut the cake for themselves. So right now is everybody for themselves situation. In the future, I think this situation is probably going to last for at least 5 years, or even more, like 10 or 15 years. So I agree with the managing director of the IMF has been mentioned. It's probably going to be a turbulent, 5 years plus another 10 years, years ahead of us.
Anthony, there was also a big focus on the transition to a green economy around the world. In fact, the IMF chief did say as much, but there are also concerns about the political situation in the United States. Politics may get in the way of that if Donald Trump is re-elected president in November. I mean, you remember that he pulled the United States out of the Paris Accords when he was in the White House. So what happens to that transition if there's a big political change in the country?
Well, I think you can see a little bump in the road, but I think that when we are talking about moving economies towards the green stages, we're thinking about what's going to be happening over the next 10 or more years. A presidential administration only lasts 4 years, so we can easily see changes. But I think longer term, the horse is out of the barn. We are, in fact, going to make the world a greener place. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's necessary for sustainability. So we are definitely going to move in that direction, whether we move quicker or slower, but we're definitely going to move in that direction over the longer period of time.
Klisman, Murati, I want to talk about some of the work that your company has been doing. That's Pareto. You've just released the Global Power Index. I see the United Kingdom is ranking 5th, ahead of Germany. What is the criteria that you use when determining these rankings?
Yeah, so when we're looking at the GPI, it's a very holistic measure. So what we have are 6 sub-indices that we're looking at when creating this. We're looking at a country's active consumer markets, we're looking at their military balance, their technological leadership, their sustainability important commodities, their geo-strategic positioning, and the financial strength. And all of these 6 have their own indices where we rank the 194 countries against. So it's very thorough and it's very holistic, because when you're looking at the growth of an economy, you're really looking at the growth and health of the country as a whole. And it's sort of factors which will contribute positively or negatively to its long-term growth. So we're about looking at a country long-term. And as economists, sometimes we have a tendency of looking at the world through very short-term, quarter-by-quarter lenses, which doesn't help the long-term cause at all. So this index allows you to triangulate any country against any other country across very vital measures, so you can build a long-term picture, so investors can do a better job in investing for the long run, and also policymakers can look at what they can be doing better, so that long-term growth and long-term health of the economy of that country actually happens.
One other thing, Klisman, and that is there are so many countries in the world that are holding elections this year. In fact, half the planet's holding elections. The United Kingdom is not an exception to that. There will be an election there. Do you expect any major changes?
In the UK, I think there's very specific dynamics in the UK that need to be explored. That is, when Boris Johnson came to power with such a majority, he came to power off the back of Brexit and his promises with that, which really swayed traditional Labour voters to go with the Conservatives because of that message of Brexit. But now that Brexit has come and gone, I think those voters who voted Conservatives are now looking at what more can the Conservative Party offer them, as opposed to what Labour is promising. And I think unless Rishi Sunak can come up with some sort of strategy and vision for the country which can keep these voters engaged, then I think we'll see a big swing towards Labour for sure. But in terms of macro impacts to the world, I think the election that matters the most is the US election for two main reasons. First of all, its foreign policy and what it decides to do with that, because it leads the world in that sense, and also its domestic fiscal policy. I mean, borrowing in the US is at all-time highs, and I think what happens with the US economy will impact the world so greatly that that is the main election which I think has the biggest sway on the world economy. The UK will be obviously very important, but nowhere near the impact that the US economy will have.
Qiang, China, of course, has long been regarded as the manufacturing center of the world, but we have been hearing a lot, especially from Premier Li Qiang, who's been talking about shifting to scientific and technological innovation to build domestic momentum. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think China has chosen another, different way of technology breakthrough. Just as I mentioned, we didn't have much of the breakthrough in technology fundamentally in the past, 5 years. A lot of people will say, no, hold on for it. We have AI right now, but AI actually are not providing very valuable jobs to, general mass majority of people. Actually, they're killing, or we can put it in this way, they're genociding the white-collar jobs or, middle-income jobs. Well, we're supposed that the AI probably should, take away all kinds of, low-end jobs, help people to elevate to a higher level in the wage and the creativity. But right now, actually the white-collar job has been taken away, so which is very, very bad for the, aggregate and, demand. This is bad. And also, I think China is going to, choose another way is that how can we just use this technology to, to have, new quality of development, to auto-drive vehicles, the robo-factories. So actually we can, actually take advantage of the technology to produce something really useful rather than just to give you some video clips. And also I think China is trying to go greener and go more efficient, because back on that is we have a demographic change major, on the aging problems, on the children problems. So which is very huge, because in another 10 or 20 years, you're going to see the major change in the supply side in the most important, providers of the world product. And also, I would like to add another one is that the demographic structures is also going to change very fundamentally in the USA, because it's a larger demand side because of all kinds of immigration situation. Right. So changes is coming.
Okay. We are going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.